Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 95th video in our Master Series and the 9th video in our subgroup mixing. Tonight we're going to talk about support tracks. So you kind of have to bear with me a little bit on this. I might ramble a little bit like I normally do, but support tracks are pretty simple. There's a couple differences and things that I want to address, but for the most part, I try to deal with my support tracks just and process them with most of the same kind of things I was talking about when doing out front tracks. There's a couple differences we'll talk about. And then one of the first things you got to keep in mind that if you do a lot of elaborate out front track processing, you might want to simplify your support track processing. And if you do a lot of simple processing on your out front tracks, you can do a lot more elaborate processing on your support tracks. And that way that you can have depth, but not without convoluting and causing mud. So you can make them both very complicated, but depending on how big the production is, you can very quickly get into muddy mess. So be real careful of that. And when you start putting on reverb, be real careful about reverb on your out front tracks and your support tracks so they preserve clarity. So basically, whenever we're talking about support tracks, for the most part, normally we're talking about like you got out front vocal and harmonies to it. That's one instance of having like support tracks. Another example would be like you have an out front vocal and a jazz trio over on the side that's a trumpet, a sax, and a trombone. And over on the other side, you've got three, harmony girls that are over there. And they're working together, and they're working really close in decibel level to the out front tracks, for certain sections. Like, and then we all get together in row, something's going on and something they're doing. And they're really close in decibel level to the out front tracks, because they are very supportive. They're doing either harmonies or counterpoint movements, to really, they're not backing tracks at all. They're very much support. So, it can get complicated because the more things you have that to try to address that they are supporting or backing or what they are. Because there's a couple issues. The first issue is instruments have their own frequency ranges. So if you got a production trying to fill out the spectrum, so you have a good full range in the spectrum field, the spectral field for your production, that they have their own ranges, so that you can fill out the spectrum. Well, and when you're dealing with these, you got like a decibel range that's out front tracks, a decibel range that's support tracks, and a decibel range that's backing tracks. Well, sometimes you might get a production that's like you got an out front vocalist, and they might do a couple of harmonies that would be supportive, right? And then you only got like a guitar, a bass player, and a drummer. That's all, bro. It's really hard to build that much depth out of that. And a lot of times you've got out front and then support tracks. You're trying to basically build that as out front tracks and support tracks, because most of the times, a lot of times, the bass and the guitar and the drums will be squished right up underneath that out front vocal to be as audible as possible, and they become, backing support tracks as one entity. So be careful of that. The smaller the production, the more mixed that gets. So don't get confused by that, and it's okay. Just keep it in mind that, as the production gets smaller, that gets smaller. So that concept, so you can apply that properly. So the first problem you come into with supporting tracks is dynamic issues. The first issue is you have a group of harmonies. Well, they've got dynamics that are going up and down. Now, you've worked on your out front tracks and you've got the dynamics that you want for the most part. Before you get into mixing, that may change. But your harmonies, and your support tracks are conflicting, so that you have harmony parts that are louder than the out front track vocal or something like that, and they're going back. So it's going to cause a problem. You're going to be sitting there with automation later on your out front track going, ah. So you want to avoid that. So it's a really good idea to either tame all those individual tracks or put a maximizer or compressor on the bus afterwards to really tame the dynamics. Because the out front vocal may be doing a bunch of dynamic stuff, but you want those support tracks as close in volume level to the out front vocals, but you don't want them jumping up above it and stuff like that. This might be jumping around, but those support tracks are doing less dynamic jumping around a lot of times, so that they stay supportive instead of jumping up above it, and then you have to fuss with the automation. So that's one issue. Another way of looking at that is over on the left hand side, you might have a trombone, a sax player, and a trumpet player or something. Now, one of those instruments' dynamics is really fluctuating, transients, and it's, you know, he had a lot of dynamic play while he was playing, where some of the other instruments, trying to tame each one of them so they have about the same dynamics so that you can mix them well, so none of them are riding up above each other, and also they won't ride up above, you know, your out front instrument or vocal that you're making them support tracks to. So trying to tame those dynamics, because sometimes it's okay, the support tracks might only have this much of dynamics going along, where the out front vocals got quite a bit more dynamics, and it's okay because you can push those supportive tracks up higher in decibel level, and they don't ride above the out front vocal, and they're much better supportive because you really tame the dynamics. They're not conflicting with each other. You have to go spend hours with automation, you know, on your out front tracks, you know, trying to fix that problem. So that's one thing to really look at. The next thing is panning. Try to get them panned in their own place so they have their own area, just like, you know, frequency spectrum has its own ranges, decibel ranges like we talked about, and panning ranges. Everybody's got their own space in all those areas, you know, to really make the production work. So don't get them behind something else that you have out front. Try to get them their own space as much as possible. So the next thing we're going to talk about is preserving their identity. So once you've done all that and you've taken care of that, and you've got a group of harmonies. Now, preserving their identity, there you're going to get, if you do it properly, like I've been talking about so far, that they'll preserve their identity to some point and they'll blend to some point. The preserving their identity part, there's a couple different ways. I've got one harmony person in this group of 4 harmonies like you're looking at the DAW here, but I don't hear them real well. So I have to go in there with EQ and re-EQ them a little bit to really, you know, accent, you know, his range and where he's singing so I can hear him. Now, after I've done some EQ work on him, you know, while I'm listening to him play with the other harmonies, and it's like, yeah, now I can hear him. All right, I might go back and listen to that track alone, and it might not sound as good. But now it's preserving its identity. It's still blending. That's obvious. It's going to do that at some point. But you're trying to, so you can hear each one of those harmonies pretty clearly. I can hear that guy, that guy, that guy, and that guy. And I can hear them. You know, they're not really super clear because they're blending, but I can hear them enough to where I can tell there's 4 different harmony players there. That takes work. And that's normally a little bit of EQ work. And sometimes that track by itself won't sound as good by itself, but it sounds great with the other tracks. So keep that in mind. And another thing, if you got the 3 brass section we're talking about over on the left-hand side, that you might have to re-EQ like the trombone a little bit, because you can hear the trumpet and the sax really pretty well, but the trombone's just kind of getting lost back there, and you're not really hearing it. So you're going to have to EQ it a little bit to really accent, you know, some part of the trombones, you know, timbre, you know, in its sound. And then, you know, it might not sound as good all by itself, but now it sounds really good with those other 2 brass instruments. You can hear it. I can hear trumpet, saxophone, and trombone. Yeah, dude. And after you tame the transients and you've messed with their panning, get them panned well, and you've went back and done that, those are some of the biggest things you're going to really have to worry about whenever you got support tracks, because they're very supportive. They're normally going to sound dang near like they're out front, like the out front vocal, but underneath it, just riding right underneath it, but really close, so that it becomes like this blended thing that they preserve their own identity, but they're still out front. That's just kind of holding the out front thing up, you know, and not like. And that takes time to really kind of understand that, but I hope I'm relating that well enough so you can hear, so you can understand that. And normally those are some of the biggest things that you're going to run into. You know, trying to deal, we talked about, you know, at the first video about just basically a workflow of mixing. You know, mixing the levels of them is not that difficult. Just takes a little bit of time. Make sure your system's set up properly, and you're trusting your meters, and you're trusting your ears, and you take equal loudness contour into consideration so that you don't have things, you know, so you mix properly. And it's not that difficult a concept. Like I need to sit here and mix harmonies for you, and then this one I'm gonna turn up one half a dB, and then that one, I mean, it doesn't really normally work like that because every situation can be different. So they're gonna do no dang good anyway, because there's thousands and thousands of different scenarios that you might run into that you're gonna have to approach it as this new thing until you get used to it. And you might run into that thing a lot, and then it becomes something that you're used to doing and have a workflow set up for this type of reggae or something. You know what I'm saying? So, that's true also. So basically, that's a pretty simple concept, and that's normally how I deal with support tracks and how I see support tracks. In the next videos, we will talk some more about backing tracks. There's a couple different things we're going to deal with when we're dealing with backing tracks. Backing tracks can be a group that are basically one off to the side. It can be a symphony. It can be all kinds of things. And the drums are backing tracks, most of the time. And sometimes they come up and be support during different sections, like we talked about, because sometimes it can be in sections. At some point, these things, certain instruments or things that are going on, and during this one section they're really supportive, and during this other section they're really backing tracks, and they're not really coming up underneath the vocal that hard. So it can, they can go back and forth, and that can change, during the length of a production. So keep that in mind. But I try to keep the process that simple and try to keep those things in mind when you're mixing your support groups. And you should be pretty fine. Trust me, we got 3 more stages we have to go through before we even get to mastering while we're mixing. So just keep in mind, 3 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 1 step back. It's okay. So kind of approach it that way, and you'll probably do pretty good. So peace, out, love. I hope you enjoyed this video on support tracks. And in the next video, we will start talking about backing tracks.